The first thing I have to do is tell you that we have received regrets from General John Williams that due to the nor'easter he cannot make the meeting in person because his roof has come off. But at any rate, he has sent his photograph, and if there's any similarity between the general and me, that's correct. I'll hand that around and give you an idea of what his uniform looks like. The other thing, he did send a message with Congo, his Negro slave, saying that even though he could not be here, he would send to help defend us from the British, the Tories, and hostile Indians, his personal artillery unit. And we've already heard them talk today, so welcome to them, and they gave a very nice presentation. My topic today includes some material which I've left on the tables for you. One deals with a little background history of General John Williams and a little background history about Sir Rubabel Collins, who was one of the gravestone carvers, a very famous gravestone carver. I'm changing my talk a little bit because it basically not about General John Williams. If we were at the cemetery, I might do a little bit more about him, but I'm going to try to give you the background of the cemetery and its importance not only to Salem, but to all historians. The Revolutionary War Cemetery was founded in 1767. That's located here in the village of Salem. And it was determined by the two churches, the New England Presbyterian Church and Dr. Clark's Presbyterian Church, the Scotch-Irish, that we needed a burial place. Often people were just buried in the field or out in the back of the house or wherever that they wanted a place they could consider to be sacred for burial. So a piece of property in the Turner patent was set aside, a glebe property for the cemetery. The cemetery is just a little bit south of here. The cemetery is basically a flat space covered with grass. As early as 1810, the town board decided to raise funds to build a 3-foot stone wall around the cemetery. It was not completed in that year. It took quite a few years for that whole wall to get completed, and if you have driven by the cemetery, you'll notice that there is a stone wall on basically 3 sides of the cemetery. 2 sides have been restored in a fashion that you can barely tell them apart from the old walls. Now, built into the walls are what's known as stiles. A stile is a stone that sits out away from the walls, built in, so that if you had to go over the wall, you would simply climb up these stairs. There would be at least one step on the top of the wall, and then down to the next step on the other side to the ground. And that was one way to get into the cemetery before they even had gates or openings to get into the cemetery. But that was just a typical way of giving access to a stone wall cemetery. Today, there are 2 wrought iron fences in the cemetery. One is for pedestrians, one is for carriages to go through. And when we rebuilt the wall on the Route 22 side, we also added a fence. So we have access to the cemetery 3 ways at this point. Those original gates were built hanging from large granite posts, and they have stood the test of time over the years. Now, within the bounds of the cemetery, if you get a chance to go in there, you will find a wrought iron fence, a square plot in the middle of the cemetery. And that was put there by the Law family, who also, well, they had money, obviously. They wanted to show that they were wealthy, so they put up this beautiful fence. And inside of this little walled-off iron fence are the most elaborate stones in the cemetery. Just the wealthy like to show they were wealthy even when they were dead. So you had these big stones. Now, ironically, they're not buried there anymore. When the Evergreen Cemetery got built in 1859, about 100 people who were in the Revolutionary War Cemetery decided to move their ancestors to the higher rent district up on the hill. And that's what happened. The Laws disinterred their family members, and they moved them up to the Evergreen Cemetery where they put up even bigger monuments for them. But if you've ever been to that Victorian-style cemetery, you know that. If you haven't been there, you should go because it's an amazing cemetery with many elaborate monuments. Now, back in 1952, the Daughters of American Revolution decided to inventory the cemetery, and they came up with 1,040 burials in the cemetery. We feel that was short because a few years later, in a project done at school by a couple of teachers who plugged the cemetery and inventoried the cemetery, and as they were doing that, they would discover stones that were buried. So if the stone wasn't standing, it didn't get inventoried. And often stones would fall over. Nobody would bother to reset them. There were no descendants left to take care of them. So eventually, the sod would just bury the stones. And the only way to find them would be to go around with a thin metal pole and stick it in the ground. And if you think there was a burial there just by what we call sinkers, a depression in the earth, you might prod, in that area, and you would hear a click, and then you would start digging and find the remnants of that stone. Now, each of these graves once had a footstone, which was common. You could have a headstone. That's why it's called a headstone, because the head of the deceased was at that end of the coffin, and the footstone was at the other end. They were there for years, but unfortunately modern mechanization of mowing cemeteries kind of did away with them, because the people who were mowing the cemetery said they're in the way, they're a pain in the neck, so they pulled them up. Many of them there were stored in one of the empty, what we call empty tombs, or early mausoleum type things. That there are a number of mounded hills that you may have noticed in the cemetery, and they were stored there. And we also discovered that a number of them were stored on the wall. People just pulled them up and put them on top of the wall. Now, there are 11 total, what we call mound mausoleums there. One is empty. You can tell it was a mound at one time, but it has been removed. And I suspect that it was removed because those bodies were disinterred and taken up to the Evergreen Cemetery. Now, the mounds, of course, were the result of the immigrants from Ireland and Scotland, where this kind of cemetery burial took place. Today we call them mausoleums, and we build them out of stone. Back then, there were field stones built up. The immigrants were very good stone builders. They would build these family mausoleums in a nice Gothic arch, and then they would sod them. So when you look at the cemetery, you say, oh, it's a nice grassy cemetery, but so are the mounds. You have all this sod growing on top of the mounds. Only one mound has what we call a metal door in it, and that was put in later by some of the descendants, making it easier to get into the vault, to put more bodies into the vault. That particular vault has sort of a traditional story here. That vault was known as a rite of passage vault in the village of Salem. And if you, as a kid, you didn't go into that vault because you had to walk and spend some time, and you didn't pass. Eventually, a number of years ago, we decided maybe we should lock the vault up, which we did, and we put a padlock on it so you can't get in there. But when it was open, there was the lid of a coffin was in there, and basically the kids would, in gesture, at least they would tease their friends about going into the vault, and you'd hear all kinds of stories about the vault, especially around Halloween time. Now, the earliest graves in this cemetery are on the north side, and many of the unique stones had carvings done by removable columns. And there are 36 stones with removable columns as engravings on these stones. And I don't know, no, she's not here. Sally Brion has left. But I would like to point out that the most comprehensive study of the carvings in this cemetery were done, researched by Sally Brion. And she did a great study on the cemetery, listing every stone, not only in our cemetery, but every other stone done by Zerubbabel Collins, who did stones, many stones over in Vermont. So it's a really nice study that she did, and I'm happy to be able to use it today. Now, just outside of the cemetery, there are 3 signs. The first one is, again, it's a New York State historical sign talking about the cemetery. And then later on, the town of Salem put up an obelisk outside of the cemetery on which it says Revolutionary War Soldiers, 1775, 1783. Within this peaceful graveyard repose the remains of about 100 men of Salem and vicinity who participated in the war for independence. Now, from the latest survey that was done, we adjusted that. Initially, they said there were 102, but we found 3 more people, so we feel there are 105 Revolutionary War soldiers buried in this cemetery. Not all of them fall with the Charlotte County Militia. Many of them moved here after the war. So we have veterans here from Connecticut and Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and the New England states. But they're all marked. Each year, the Boy Scouts and American Legion does mark the graves with a flag for Memorial Day. There's the newest sign there is a sign that just been recently refurbished by Judy and Ken Flagg. It was a sign put up pointing out that this was now on the historic register. So it is an important cemetery, one that is open to the public daily from dawn to dusk. Somebody once asked me about the color of the sign, and I said, yeah, the state assigned a color to these signs. And basically, the color of the sign is blue and yellow, and I think it's a canary yellow.
Sunflower.
Sunflower yellow and a national blue.
Royal National Blue.
Yeah, Royal National Blue. And you can still get those colors. In fact, you got them out of the hardware store, if I remember
Salem
correctly.
Hardware.
But those are the colors that should be used to make the signs consistent throughout our town and New York State. Now, the significance of the cemetery. I often tell people, I use this term a lot. I say, this is history in stone. And they look at me like, what do you mean by that? I say, it's history in stone. When you go into a cemetery and you look at a stone, you read a name. But there's more to that name. And if you take the name and you try to research it, you come up with all sorts of interesting things. And sometimes the stones give you a really good clue as to what happened. It might be this is Mary Jones, and next to it are 3 small gravestones with children's names. Say, what is that? What happened here? And so you're prompted to go back in history to see if you can find out what happened to Mary Jones. Why did they all die at the same time? If the dates are all the same, was it a fire? Was it a plague? I mean, there are lots of things that happened to families and to people at that time where they were completely wiped out. We have to keep in mind that disease was rampant at that time, and whole families were wiped out from the disease. And sometimes it's written on the stone as to what they died from. Other times it isn't, so you have to do a little research. Sometimes the stone will tell you that so-and-so was an officer in the artillery, in the Charlotte County Militia. Other times it might not say anything, and again, you would have to research, but you find out all those interesting things. So the cemetery is sort of like a history book. And the one thing you have to remember, people say, why are cemeteries so important? And I say they are important because on that stone is probably the only place where you will find out that this person existed. There is no other history about this person except on that stone. So it's really important that we keep up the cemeteries, and I'm happy to hear that is happening all over our country today when we start to realize the importance of maintaining our cemeteries. Now, cemeteries evolved, and by that I mean lots of times the construct of a cemetery and the type of stones and monuments in the cemetery are the outgrowth of the culture and the belief of the community. This cemetery, the Revolutionary War Cemetery, reflects that. When you go into the cemeteries, I've said you will see carvings of Zerubbabel Collins, and I sent a sheet around that shows you a little carving. You might want to pass those down if they're at the end of your table, because I didn't have a copy for everybody, but you can hand them around. Shows you the type of carving that was popular in the 1800s. Now, a lot of those carvings signified certain things. They're symbolic. They're symbols. And if you understand, what they are, it will give you an idea of the time period in which they were done. Keep in mind that the pilgrims of our country and the Puritans of our country were extremely God-fearsome people. And the philosophy was, every time something bad happens to me, it's because I was a sinner. And that is reflected often in cemeteries. When you look at some of these stones, you look at it and say, that's not very pleasant, that's a skull and bones. The attitude being that we're not going to go to heaven, we're all going to go to hell. So there was a lot of fear and superstition that took place during those time periods, and it was reflected symbolically on some of these stones. If I may read to you just some examples of the kind of symbols that you would find on the stones. Today we call them folk art because they look very primitive, but at the time they were state of the art because the sculptures at that time used the tools that were available to them, and particularly in the symbols, and they used the tools that were available to them to carve in the epitaphs, which were also an important part of the stone. Stone makers, well, just like today, would open up a pattern book. Say, okay, let's see, what kind of a poem do we want to put on this person's grave? And so they had stock sayings to put on the gravestones. Other times, no. Maybe the descendants or the survivors would say, no, I don't want that there. I want their military record shown. I want their professional record shown, or whatever. And they would give them the text, and they would carve it into the stone. But as you go through cemeteries, even here, you will run across text on the stones that was the same thing is said there as over here, and that's because the stone carver just put in, a standard text. But here are some of the things you can look for, and you can look for them in our cemetery and any other cemetery in which you're visiting. Early central motifs and border carvings suggest the development of symbols and an iconography which changed both regionally and with the development of the country. From these carvings, we learn of changing attitudes toward death and immortality as different periods in American history. Central motifs carry dramatic depictions of death, such as skulls and crossbones. And the material I'm handing around shows one of those, of the Collins carvings. You have sides, bones, hourglasses, all indicating mortality. And one's time cut off. As time passed, and life became a little less harsh, and the religious feeling toward death changed a little bit. But all of them are going to hell. Maybe some of us could go to heaven. Shows up on the tombstones. So we have cherubs and soul effigies, and they appear on the stones. Other motifs trace the progress of culture. Such an interest in classical portrait busts. If you go to the cemetery, the Evergreen Cemetery, you will see quite a change from what is depicted there as what is depicted here in this cemetery. They are more hopeful up there in that cemetery. You can tell just by looking at the statues and the carvings that are there. In those cemeteries, you will also see things like urns and willows, that change came about in the 19th century. Speaking of willows, You probably have all seen pictures of Abraham Lincoln and announcements of his death and so on. And what's always depicted in those? The weeping willow tree, which is a much more an optimistic approach to going to heaven. Some other border symbols, ears of corn, which is a symbol of harvest or fruitfulness. And this suggestion that the deceased have been fruitful in their labors and have themselves been harvested, called home by their master. A pineapple may reveal both the importance of the hospitality in that day and also the welcoming of the soul to its heavenly home. Motifs that are similar to those commonly found in England, Scotland, Germany, and other countries at the same time suggest the importance to some early colonies of their ties to the mother country. In other words, what we see here was brought over, with them. It's part of their culture. Mentioned was that I went to the University of Massachusetts, and I lived in Leominster, Massachusetts, and the road for me to get to Amherst to go to school was to drive through Pelham, Massachusetts. For those of you who don't know, Salem was settled by pioneers from Pelham, Massachusetts. And going back there one year to a class reunion with my wife, Sarah Jane, he said, let's stop in Pelham at the cemetery. And it was the most unique feeling to walk through that cemetery, seeing all the names there that we find here. So we said, oh yes, that's, and it dawned on us that the reason this cemetery looks like it does is because they came from here and it looks like this cemetery. So those things were carried forward as people have made their way in the world. Now today we see a whole lot of different motifs in cemeteries. You can go in and find pickup trucks in the cemetery and a model and all sorts of other things in the cemetery. But those are all indications of our attitude toward death and our attitude toward depicting the culture or the career of the person who was there in the grave. So things do change. Now, genealogically, it's important. I have people coming to see me all the time looking for information about their ancestors. And the one important place they always want to go to is the cemetery. And that's the first place we look. Let's see, can we find them? For the last week, I've had a fellow trying to find somebody buried here in the cemetery. Husband's buried here, can't find her. I'm not sure we will ever find her, but we do know that she lived in Salem, died in Salem, but where she is, we don't know. My suspicion is she is there, buried next to him, but either never was given a stone, or over the years, her stone fell apart, got broken, got tossed out. You never know. Nobody ever keeps records of all those things that happen. So that's the closest we could come. It's tough when you're looking for accreditation in order to get into the Daughters of Revolution or the Sons of the Revolution because they want facts. And I want something that tells me that she's buried here. Unfortunately, right now we don't have that information, but we'll continue looking. Epitaphs. Just to mention, there are lots of epitaphs in the cemetery, and I mentioned some of them are stock, taken right off the shelf and put in. But whether you are poor or whether you are wealthy, you can have something on your gravestone. And you can either pick it out or just go to the book and say that the car will go with that. Sometimes they are serious, sometimes they are sad, sometimes they are funny. One that I was, and I'm not even sure this is true, but when I was told, that epitaph on the stone said, "See, I told you I was sick." Okay, so much for the cemetery. Again, I said the cemetery is an important place, and it is like stones in history. In our old burying ground, now known as the Revolutionary War Cemetery, are our oldest pioneers in Salem. General John Williams and his family were buried there. They're no longer there. his heirs decided when the new cemetery came along that they would disinter the bodies and build them in the new cemetery. And if you drive into Evergreen, immediately on the right, you get the symbolism of this. On the highest spot in the cemetery, a huge cross with tombstones surrounding this cross of all the Williams family. So again, that was the attitude at that time of the Williams family to say, we're here, and you really can't miss it. I put a slip on your table, just a little background about John Williams. I'll read just a brief definition here. You never know who's buried in your cemetery until you go in and start looking around, saying, oh, this looks interesting. I wonder what they did. But then oftentimes, they are forgotten people because it happened 200 years ago, 300 years ago, and we just have not read a record about them or heard about them at that time. But General John Williams, of course, came from Barnstable, England. He was born in 1752, died in 1806, became a brigadier general. He was known at that time the Charlotte County Militia initially, and then changed to the name of Washington in honor of George Washington. His wife was Susanna Turner, who came here with the first pioneer, James Turner. They were one of the first three pioneering families. Interesting story about Susanna and John Williams, because they did marry. A smallpox problem came about, and Dr. Williams at that time was living over in Pollock, Vermont, where he owned land, but he heard about the epidemic, came to Salem, he thought he could help. James Turner had smallpox. James Turner unfortunately died. In the meantime, Dr. Williams and Susanna kind of hit it off. So they ended up getting married about a year later, and she had children of her own, and they also had children between that particular marriage. So they had a total of, 4 children. Yep. 4 children, Susan, Elizabeth, Maria, and then Colonel John Williams. Margaret Tilford. Here's an interesting story. You could walk through the cemetery and say, oh, Margaret Tilford, so what? Well, when you started to look at her history, you discovered that Margaret Tilford in 1777 was accused of being a witch. Now, why did that happen? We don't really know, except we know what happened in Salem, Massachusetts. We had a hysteria of accusation. Remember, I told you people were very, very careful about their religion. They were concerned. They were superstitious. And therefore, we had all these young girls being accused of being witches. So this is taking place many years later. We did have people come from Salem, Massachusetts, who lived here in Salem, New York. The theory is that a fellow up the road accused Margaret of poisoning his cow. Archie Livingston said, my cow has stopped giving milk. I can't get any cream anymore. And I saw Margaret Tilford out there making funny signs. And then I saw a black cat run by. And then smoke came down my chimney into my house. And I know it's Margaret, etc. And he said, I went to a soothsayer, which he did. And soothsayer who read cards, read the cards for him and said, yes, a neighbor of yours has cursed you. So he took that information and decided to charge Margaret Tilford as being a witch. At that time, cases like that did not go before a county court or a town court. It went before a church court. And so Margaret Tilford was brought before the session of the Presbyterian Church, and the accusations were given to her and given to the church trustees at that time. And they began to hear this case about Margaret being a witch. The trial never concluded, because in the middle of the trial, word came down that General John Burgoyne was in Fort Edward, and he was going to make his way south, and he was going to sack every town in his path, including Salem. So they broke up very quickly, and everybody beat it out of town. They were scared to death. Of course, is this true? And so it left the case open. The theory is that Margaret was charged with being a witch because, first of all, her husband was seen working on a Sunday, which was anathema to the Presbyterian laws at that time. You did not work on Sunday. And it might have even been more just stepping out of the house to get a piece of wood to put in the fireplace. Another theory was that some people didn't like her, so they charged her because they thought she was a Tory, a political charge. And so that was part of it. After the war, Margaret petitioned, this could happen, people who left town because they were considered to be Tories would petition to come back. Say, we saw the light, we're no longer Tories. And they were invited to come back to town, as was Margaret and her family. But the irony of the story is, even though she came back, she and her children were still ostracized in the town. Just could not shake the claim of her being a witch. But an interesting story. Let me mention, see, we're getting close to our time here, I think.
Yeah, we have, well, you can go a little past because they're having a business meeting in the
Okay,
library.
because there are just a couple of other people I wanted to mention because they were so unusual. A fellow by the name of St. John Honeywood lived here in Salem for a while. His real name was Sanctus Johannes Honeywood. He was born in Leicester, Massachusetts, went to Yale, where he got his degree, but he was an orphan. And the family he stayed with, taken in by Dr. Stiles, who was the president of Yale, and his wife during his college education. He became a lawyer and then decided to settle in Salem. And in the meantime, he had married a woman by the name of Clarissa Mosley of Wakefield, Massachusetts. Came to Salem primarily for the law practice and to be the principal of Salem Washington Academy. He was best known for writing. He was a poet, and he wrote many, many poems which ended up being published in anthologies throughout the years. One of his most famous poems was Darby and Joan. And very quickly, Darby and Joan was a story about a married couple. The husband one day complaining to his wife how easy her life was because he had to go out and earn a living, etc., etc., etc. And of course the wife said, well, why don't we trade places? So they did, for a day. And of course he soon learned that being a wife and taking care of the house and doing the laundry and doing the cooking and taking care of the kids and so on. He finally conceded at the end of the day, well, I guess you're right. I appreciate your position more than I ever thought of. And that was basically the poem, but as you look at it, you know, it tends to do away with the traditional concepts we have of what a woman's job is and what a man's job is. And that poem's still going around. He was also an artist, did some oil paintings. One of his most famous was Training Day here on Main Street. Because the militia was here once a month, they would come out in the uniforms and horses and weapons, and they would train. Interesting thing is, and people have asked me one time, did Indians ever live in Salem? And I'm saying, yes, I believe so. And if you look at this photograph, not a thing to be proud of, but if you look at the oil painting in the left corner, there are two Indians lying on the ground, basically drunk. That's the interpretation of this picture. I received some material the other day, some pitch material, and in it were two church arrowheads. And it said, from Fitch's Point. And then there was a nice reed basket. Inside the reed basket it said, made by the Indians who lived at Fisher's Point. I had never seen those things before, but further proof that yes, the Indians did live here at one time. Do you happen to know what tribe that would be, Ted? Oh, at any rate,
Wouldn't it be Algonquin?
could be. It could. Final story about St. John Munwood. When his wife wanted to go back home to Wakefield to visit her parents, so she said, I'm going to go home for a couple of weeks, and here's what you have to do. John St. Honeywood was an intellectual, not a farmer, not very practical, not very handy around the house. He said, here's what you have to do. You've got to feed the pigs every day. And here's the food, and feed them this time and this time. Well, St. John Honeywood did that for a couple of days, and he said, I don't like this. He said, I got other things to do. So the next day he brought out all the food and left it for the pigs and went off and did his thing. And of course, when his wife came home a few days later, the pigs were all dead. They had just eaten themselves out of existence. But that was St. John Honeywood. Very, brilliant, but impractical. So, okay, just one more here with Dr. Abram Allen, because this is an interesting story. Dr. Abram Allen was buried in the Revolutionary War Cemetery, but he too has moved up to the High Ranch District. His story is interesting because Abraham Gray from Rupert was out cutting down a tree, and unfortunately the tree fell on him and killed him. And he was rushed down here to the doctors, and Dr. Allen saw him, although actually he wasn't quite dead. He was really badly hurt. And Dr. Allen said, okay, we'll trepan him. I don't know if any of you know. Trepanning meant drilling a hole in the skull to release the pressure and the blood that was building up in the skull. And he did that. And he called in Dr. Williams. He'd come on in and examine this guy with me. And this patient did not seem to be getting better. So they put their heads together and said to the family, we think we need to trepan him again. And we think that will work. And the family said, no. You know what happened to the patient? The patient died. Dr. Allen was so upset with the family not allowing that and feeling that they were accusing him of being a poor doctor and not saving the patient, that one night after the patient had been buried, he and his servant went to the Revolutionary War Cemetery and dug up the body and took the head back to Dr. Allen's house, which still exists here on West Broadway. He did an autopsy. Two things were wrong. One, it was against the law to exhume a body. Two, it was against the law to do an autopsy on a body, which makes it kind of funny because, well, maybe you've seen old films about England where people go into a cemetery and steal bodies and doing all the Frankenstein story. But at any rate, the only way doctors could learn was to work on a body. So they would pay people to go steal the body, and they would secret it someplace and do their thing. At any rate, it was discovered by neighbors who saw the lights at night when the doctor went there with his servant to dig up the body and turned him in. So he did go to court. He went to criminal court here at the courthouse, and they heard the case. They had witnesses come in, tell what's going on, and the doctors gave their testimony. And afterward, the judge said, well, Dr. Allen, we're going to find you guilty. And he cited those two things that I said. And we're going to fine you £5. And that was the verdict. We fined him £5. Now, did that ruin the doctor's career? No. The doctor became so famous that his practice improved immensely. Hey, this guy's pretty good. He knows what he's talking about. Actually, then that whole scenario was made into a play by Joe Childs and has been performed here at least once in town of Salem. So it's an interesting story. I do have other stories, but I think we're running close to time, so I'll stop here. Any quick questions?
In view of this, I always look at cemeteries as being a wonderful cultural thing to constantly remind us that we are here today because of those who came before us. Now, in view of the fact that I understand cremation is expanding tremendously and that cemeteries and places are dying out, what impact, if any, do you think that might have on history and finding it?
Well, unless somebody puts up a stone, and I know I have personal experience with that, cremation, but no stone, any evidence that, they did not want a plot, did not want a stone, so the only evidence is in the family record or an official, state, local, federal record that they were here. I think in the long run, it probably will make it somewhat difficult sometimes to find what you're looking for. Because a lot of us, you want to go back to your roots, but there are no roots. And I'm not against cremation, I understand cremation. My strong feeling is though, fine, put up a stone. If nothing else, it gives closure. That's my opinion, it gives closure. Any other questions? Okay, I want to thank the cannoneers for coming forward.